Yeah, so I guess we can, after those great introductions, we can dive right in. As Rahul just mentioned, the rapid increases in our capabilities in space offer opportunities to significantly enhance our ability to comprehensively measure, monitor, and model climate change, the effects of climate change, and global efforts to reduce emissions. And so really wanted to start off broadly by saying, why is space technology so crucial in addressing climate challenges? And interested in everyone's insights as to your role and experiences at this intersection of space innovation and climate sciences, and for your excellency also in the environment. So I think maybe we'll start at the far end and work back, if you want to start with Martin.
Thank you, Lloyd. So at the MOLDIS Space Research Organization, which is a fairly young organization, we're a little over a year old. Really, there's, in my view, three main goals. One is to reimagine and reinvent what the Maldivian identity means. One of the most understated aspects of climate resilience and climate adaptation is the mental component. What does it mean for a population that is constantly facing a climate crisis to be filled with hope, to reinvent a purpose or an identity that allows them to imagine and work towards an innovative future. And at Mesro, what we always say is Maldivians have always looked to the stars. Our founders discovered the islands using the stars, and now we're trying to discover this innovative future where we genuinely believe that Maldives can be a strong contributor to space. And so that's the most important goal for us. The second, obviously, has been discussed in the previous panels and is quite common knowledge, is space can really help this battle against the climate crisis. And we're trying to demonstrate to the population of the Maldives, but also to the rest of the island nations, that space technology has a really important role to play in understanding the environment, but also in taking proactive measures against the climate crisis. Not to mention disaster management and early warning all depend heavily on space assets. And the third component is perhaps a little bit nuanced as well. It is to demonstrate to the rest of the world, especially the space community, that Maldives is not just a passive consumer of space technology, but that we have a pivotal role to play in helping the space technologies adapt and better adjust to the evolving climate. We are a large ocean nation, as we like to call it, rather than a small island state. And so that means the oceans, which are the engine for climate change and the global climate, need to be studied a lot more, and the Maldives offers that. So we would like to position ourselves in that perspective, that our role is not just to take the technology, but also co-create and co-evolve it.
Artie?
I think we mustn't take space for granted. We've said it before, let's say it again. Without space, we would not know that there was a climate crisis. 26 out of the 54 essential climate variables can only be measured from space, whether it's measuring the concentration of carbon in the atmosphere, the temperature and the level of the oceans, the melting of the glaciers, or the quality of vegetation. I mean, the list goes on and on. These are things that you can only do from space. I think space technology can help help climate action in a very proactive way. We are not just the photographers. We're not just the tech support. It really enables climate action. Using satellite communications, we can help reduce the carbon emissions that come from the aviation sector. Using high-resolution imagery, we can help prevent illegal deforestation, as I'm sure Andrew will talk about. So it's very much a proactive agenda, and we must see it as such. Our role in the UN is fundamental here. We see that we are very far from really leveraging the potential that satellite data and solutions have. We are far from leveraging that potential. In Africa, there are countries that are facing deforestation, but they're not making use of satellite to control it or to prevent it. Why not? First of all, there's a complete lack of awareness of what can be achieved. And secondly, the question of capacity. Too many people who need it do not know how to make use of these solutions. So as UNUSA, as the custodians of space for the SDGs, we really see it as our responsibility to bridge that gap between supply on the one hand and demand on the other. First and foremost, to promote satellite data and solutions and to facilitate access to that data, to do capacity building to enable member states, to empower them with the ability of how to use this data, to push for the integration of space and satellite solutions into policy making. That's really, really essential, and I'm so glad that we have Her Excellency with us. I hope you're listening. I'll give you my notes afterwards.
I'm listening very closely.
Yeah, and finally, to ensure coordination amongst the different space solution providers. We don't have standardization amongst the different qualities of data that are out there. We need interoperability as well. So there's so many different angles which are proactive actions that need to be taken. We must see it as such.
Your Excellency.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be with you here today and in this panel. And I will pick from one line that Arne have mentioned at the end of the previous panel. I was listening very closely. When you said let's focus on planet A. Let's not think about that we have a planet B and we have to think about that. We're very excited about all the projects and the missions that we have in the UAE and worldwide when it comes to lunar exploration, space exploration. But we need to also focus on harnessing the capacities and the technologies that are available in the space spectrum in empowering the climate change solutions. The crisis that we have is a worldwide crisis, and we have to make sure that we have the bigger picture. So that's what space technologies provide us, the big picture, the identification of the big data, and the utilization of those data to identify patterns and also provide early warnings. This last summer, more than I think ever before, we have witnessed natural phenomena that have affected parts of the world that did not affect before. And relying on satellite imaging and sensory information that we can get, but we need as well to be able to analyze and utilize. You've mentioned a lot of the information and parameters that we can monitor through satellite imaging, but how can we as well couple that with sensory information that we can get from on the ground so we can make more effective decisions and get more information, whether it's on a macro level or on a micro level. There are also other activities that satellite imaging help us to monitor. Wildlife and environmental crimes, overfishing, things that need to really be monitored, and we as policymakers need to get all of those information. Being informed allow us to design better policies that are going to be sustainable, and not policies for today, policies for 50 years, 100 years maybe from now. The world is changing so fast, and we have to be dynamic. And another element that satellite imaging provides us is that we have real-time information that we can act upon.
Thank you, Lloyd, and thank you all of you, and Your Excellency. It's great to follow I love being at the end of the line, as it befits someone whose last name begins with a Z. I'm always at the end of the line.
Right after the W's, I should say.
That's right. Right. We should switch. We should switch spots, Lloyd. I'd like to take a step back for a moment when we think about sustainability, climate. Think about, in fact, actually, the set of interlocking challenges that confront us as citizens of the Earth. We have enormous challenges dealing with the disruptions of climate. We are facing an ecocide, perhaps the 6th time in the history of life on Earth that we know, where biodiversity is collapsing at an unprecedented speed. And we have enormous issues of cooperation and collaboration, dissent and conflict, a kind of fraying of the international multilateral order of cooperation. Now, let's think about climate just for a moment. Climate isn't a problem. It's really billions of problems. It's billions of interconnected problems in which we have to move with enormous speed. We have to move with enormous levels of cooperation. We have to act in new ways and develop new kinds of policies. And none of that, I hope, is controversial to anyone in this room. So what are some things we know? And this is a way of maybe addressing the things we heard from all of the esteemed guests here today and panelists. Well, the first thing we know is we have to make a lot of decisions, we have to take a lot of actions, and we have to do it quickly and collectively. And we know that the rate-limiting factor of the policy actions we can take is the speed of information we receive, the velocity of information that Her Excellency just mentioned, right? If we're measuring the world once a year or once every few years, we can only know whether or not our actions are actually being effective every year or every couple of years, and that is far too slow. For those of you who don't know my home institution, and I was so pleased to see all of the amazing panelists today, I feel like my organization sits on the shoulders of so much of the work that was discussed this morning. But our organization, Planet, operates the largest constellation of Earth-observing satellites in history. They're actually quite small, about the size of a loaf of bread. We've put hundreds of them into orbit, into a giant ring around the Earth. And if you'll excuse me for my impertinence, let's imagine for a moment that Her Excellency is the sun. Not hard to imagine.
Thank you very much.
This level of flattery, I worked on this level of flattery, I want you to know. So here's the Earth. You will remember it's spinning around on a daily basis, is going around the sun. This is a group of hundreds of satellites that spin from the North Pole to the South Pole over the equator, between the sun and the Earth, and they collectively image the entire planet, well, we should say, the terrestrial landmass and near oceans of the Earth and some of the deep oceans of the Earth every day in high resolution. When you are measuring the whole planet every day, you can begin to think about taking actions every day. So you can accelerate the velocity of the policy actions we need. The second thing that I've noticed is something I want to call out for those of you who were in the earlier sessions. You heard this thing about space. Space unlocks awe, we would say in English, A-W-E. It unlocks something in our spirits. And one of the things it unlocks is a sense of very deep generosity toward each other. And one of the things that I find really fascinating is that carries forward right to the products of the assets that we make. So we make data. We make literally like 40 terabytes of data a day about the Earth. We keep it in perpetuity. We use the tools of artificial intelligence to extract information about it, essential signals and patterns about the Earth. But here's what's really fascinating. If you just look here, and this was not really by design, but for instance, our organization, a private sector organization, influenced by the culture of the public sector institutions that enabled it, and oriented around climate change, is keenly interested in helping to address particularly countries that are on the front lines of loss and damage and climate risk, like Maldives. And we are working together now with the Maldives with the support of the UAE Space Agency. So what you're seeing is the multilateral collaboration that is essential for us to effectuate climate action also comes out of not just the data, but the culture of this whole enterprise.
Great. So actually, since you mentioned the Maldives, and I guess you're working with them, Madan, you're a country, a place that's really on that front lines, really is experiencing it firsthand, and it's really great to have you here because we need those voices here. And so I just want to give you an opportunity to see how you see smaller actors like yourself, especially in the global south, getting involved in making space assets contribute to climate change monitoring, and what can the larger players do more to help? What are you looking for from other people as well?
A great question, Lloyd. And yeah, I'll definitely bounce off what Andrew said. We definitely need more planets. The company, not the actual planet Earth, because we only have one, as Arti also mentioned. But just to kind of again take a step back and also highlight why we need that collaboration. It's not just because the Maldives need the help from the rest of the world. It's because the rest of the world depends on countries like the Maldives that are coral nations. Corals are, as you call it, the canary in the coal mine. The corals are very sensitive to even minute changes in the sea temperature. And so we need to monitor them at a higher resolution, at a faster rate, which Planet allows us to do, in order to truly understand how are coral bleaching effects affecting different types of corals, different types of reefs, different topographies even. And this has traditionally been very difficult because typically you would hear that there's a lot of data already in the space sector. You'd always hear there's a lot of data already, use the data. But when we talk about the lot of data that are available, you're talking about sea surface temperature data that is 5 kilometer by 5 kilometer. Yeah. That is literally more than a couple of our islands in a single pixel, which means it doesn't give us the granularity we need to understand truly the dynamics of an island nation such as the Maldives. Now, the importance of that is, by understanding what's happening in the Maldives, you can extend it to other island nations around the world. There are almost 1 billion people in the world that depend either directly or indirectly on the produce that the coral reefs create. Corals are known as the rainforests of the ocean because they're so rich in biodiversity. And another important point to highlight as well is, as Arti mentioned, the importance of space towards SDGs. What's truly understated is how important SDG 14 is for the rest of the SDGs. SDG 14, which is life below water, is the highest co-benefit SDGs to the rest of the SDGs. Around 38% of all SDGs benefit directly or indirectly from solving the SDG 14. And so what Maldives offers is for us to work together, understand life below water, and then build solutions collectively that can then be extended to the rest of the world. I'll give you a very specific example on coastal erosion. It's a typical problem that usually we monitor once a year or maybe a couple of times a year. But in an island nation like the Maldives, when within 3 to 6 months our shorelines change, the beach on the east disappears in the eastern monsoon and then now appears on the western side in just a couple of months, we need that granularity. And the last point I kind of wanted to also highlight was there's such a potential that a country like the Maldives can offer to space companies, especially in terms of ground truthing. We know that space assets are typically worse off when it comes to monitoring the ocean. We are 99% ocean, and what we can really work together with is establishing IoT-based sensors that are in our island nation, in the ocean, in the reefs, in our islands, that will automatically collect the data as a satellite task and takes an image. So those kind of innovative approaches that are more focused on co-creation rather than treating Maldives as a vulnerable nation that just needs some aid, throw some money at us, and then hope that the problem goes away. Unfortunately, it's a lot more challenging than that. And we would like to position ourselves as a potential partner that can really help solve. And Planet has taken, alongside with the UAE Space Agency, great strides in that effort.
Great. So you talk a lot about the need for that ground truth and for data and communications. And I come back to Arti, and because so much of that now is coming from commercial companies, and again, Madan, you also talked about the SDGs. And so Arti, I want to come back to you. You talked a little bit about the roles that that you see for space and climate, but I want to give you an opportunity to talk about where you see international cooperation and also the efforts that you're doing in particular to bring that commercial sector into UNOSA and coordinate across that, which I think is somewhat new.
Yeah, international cooperation is at the heart of what we do. We have programs to support countries to implement strategies and policies. What Madan just said about capacity building, local capacity, is absolutely fundamental. We run something called UN Spider, that's a space-based information for disaster and emergency response. And in that program, we not only help with the policies and strategies, but we actually run technical advisory missions or institutional strengthening missions to ensure that you have professionals in every country who are trained in how to access and use data. But the cooperation with the private sector is really important. So I've since coming into the office, I've heard like you said, that there's so much data. I have European Space Agency saying Copernicus data is there. It's available for free. The BRICS constellation, China and so on, lots of data, high revisit times, want to make this available, in the service of developing nations. And on the other hand, I have countries saying, this is all very nice, all these case studies and use cases you tell us, these are great stories, but we can't afford that data. So this is where the real importance of international collaboration, you're really hitting the nail on the head there. How do we find mechanisms to bridge that gap between the supply and demand? How do we do that? And that's where USA is only 35 people. We might be the custodians of space for the SDGs for the whole UN system, but at the end of the day, if you don't leverage partnerships and the knowledge and the resources that lie in different places, then you won't be able to answer those questions. We need the private sector also to amplify the power of space for climate. Governments and the UN don't do marketing in that sense, but we really need to. If you want to influence policy making, you first have to show what you're capable of achieving, and so that's one of the most important things. Recently, a less obvious example of cooperation came on my radar. Airbus approached us and said, "Look, high-resolution data. We require a specific spectrum, radio frequency spectrum, to enable it." But this was at risk of being given away to the mobile operators to be used for 5G and 6G. And it was the UN voice at the ITU's World Radio Conference in November here in Dubai that really drove it home how without this frequency spectrum, we will no longer have access to high-resolution SAR data, which is crucial for enabling climate action. So there are many different ways that we can imagine when we think about international collaboration, many different levels. And I think also the fact that the private sector is at the forefront of developing innovative solutions to process data and information to support decision making, we have to be creative and open to the way we think about this. And I look forward to having companies like Planet address Scopus, address the member states, and talk about some of these innovations and how we can help bridge that gap, as I said, between supply and demand.
Yeah, you talk about these intersections and all the different pieces and data and things and the importance of partnerships. And so I'm going to come back to Andrew because Planet has really been out in front in this area of partnerships and partnering with climate and technology companies. We spoke a little bit at COP, and I know in Davos there was a significant amount of discussion about some of those partnerships. And so maybe you want to talk about how Planet and the tech companies are all working together to address some of these issues in terms of capacity and data as it goes to climate.
I greatly appreciate the question. Let me start with we're here at the World Governments Summit, which I think, this is the third one of these I think I've been to, and I've watched it evolve. We're actually not at the World's Space Technology Conference. Right. We're here at the World Government Summit. So what I'd like to do is perhaps put it back into that frame for a moment. In my home country, for a very long time, all of the things we're talking about were the sole provenance of governments. They were entirely designed for the principal users and principal actors in that space, which were governments. They were scientific and defense and intelligence kinds of applications of these technologies. And I think, I must say, wisely and perhaps counterintuitively, then to see this strategy of government begin to really intentionally open up space for industrial development, for the creation of new kinds of startups and things like that. What are the benefits that come from a private sector approach? And I promised to connect this back to what Arti was saying a moment ago. Well, first of all, you get enormous cost efficiencies. All of the hundreds of satellites the Planet has built and deployed onto orbit cost less than a single publicly funded satellite from a large science institution like NASA or ESA. all of the data we've ever collected. We've been measuring the whole world every day for the last 7 years. We have a data set. All of that together, all of the hardware, all of the launch costs, all of that stuff, less than a single publicly funded site. So that's really valuable. But then there's this other thing, which is, and I think it was mentioned in one of the other panels, we move much, much faster. So we're innovating and innovating and innovating, and the marginal utility of turning back to our parents, so to speak, in government and saying, should we do this, is reduced as we are learning a ton. But now there's this critically important thing, which is how do you take this rapidly growing infant is turning into a teenager, and how do you get them to bring value back to government? Right? So what we're talking about here with the SDGs, and to put numbers on it, we did an independent technical analysis. We found that with an outside academic institution, they found that our data was relevant to measuring some 80 targets and another 80 or so indicators under 14 of the 17 SDGs. The UN Environment Program said it was the single most relevant data set for the Sustainable Development Goals in existence. The question is then, how do you bring it back to common purpose? So our central strategy there in serving governments is not just to work bilaterally with governments, which we do around the world, including with Her Excellency's government, but we also produce what we call digital public goods. And I'll just give you one example. Today, deforestation is a critical problem around the world, and particularly around the tropical belt of the Earth, which is where all the trees are and where most of the forest carbon is stored. There's a big UN program called the REDD+ program. It stands for Reducing Emissions from Deforestation and Forest Degradation, REDD+. And what it does is that it creates a mechanism where donor nations can pay forest asset holding countries not to cut down their forests, to create an economic counter-incentive to the normal incentives of clearing your land for agriculture or for other purposes. And that program depends on having an independent measurement tool to tell you whether or not our forests are being cut down and how often. So the government of Norway financed Planet for, I will say, pennies on the dollar. This is mostly almost philanthropy on our side, to make all of the forest data that we collect from 30 degrees north to 30 degrees south, covering 64 countries across the tropical belt, available to their ministries of forestry for free. So we have one standard. One of the very first projects that we worked on, in complement to that one, and this goes to our colleague from the Maldives, is something called the Allen Coral Atlas, which is an effort to comprehensively map all of the world's shallow water coral reefs from space. That effort has led to 30 new marine protected areas being established around the world, just by making the invisible visible. This combination of state cooperation and philanthropic partnership to create digital public goods creates the certainty that data will be available to address the kinds of problems that RT just mentioned and that we collectively need. Like now the job of government and the private sector, I think, is to work together to unlock the value that we're creating together. Because the good news is that we're now measuring change as fast as the planet is changing. And now the critical thing is to get that into people's hands.
Great. Actually, so some of the things that you were touching, Your Excellency, you also talked about, the real-time data, looking at early warnings, looking at sustainable policies, and so, you're taking on this new role while the UAE remains in the glow of really a historic COP28, where the nexus of space data and climate were extensively discussed, and the UAE really punches above its weight both in space and climate. So I'm just curious, beyond some of the things that you talked about, if you want to talk about some of your priorities in the new role and how the different parts of the UAE are working together at these intersections.
So allow me first to comment on the partnership part. So the collaboration is a must, not only between government and private sector, but governments to governments and private sector to private sector. Because we're at a point that no one can afford to start from square zero. We don't have that leverage. And we owe it to the world, to Earth, so that we all bring together our efforts to make something out of this because of the size and the different multi-dimensions of the challenge that we are all facing. The COP28 and the historic moments that we have all witnessed was a proof that collaboration, this kind of collaboration, can really happen. And the starting points of all the declarations and the announcements, establishments of funds, this is a starting point. But now we're at a point where we need to make sure that all of these promises deliver to what we did. And this is something that the UAE is very keen on. And I was really glad to hear the UAE Space Agency name going around the conversation, because during COP as well, there are multiple activities that the UAE Space Agency has led. One of them is the Hack for Climate. It looks like you have some information about that as well. So the Hack for Climate was a platform that brought together 50 different experts, researchers, and programmers. Because even if we have abundance of data that we can get from the space technologies and space agencies, but then what we do with those data? How can we leverage on all the data that we are getting and make sure that we are using them to really address the challenges that we have at hand? And during that exercise, there was a review of the solutions that are being used or designed for climate change challenges. Another opportunity was when they've held the Space Agency's Leadership Summit. And during the summit, there was a pledge from the space agencies that have attended to really commit to achieving the targets and the objectives of the Paris Agreement, and how we can leverage on all the projects, all the efforts that are being invested from worldwide, from space agencies, to solve those problems, to really push the boundaries toward achieving the targets of the Paris Agreement. And that also comes from leadership and government and different agencies level. But then we also have to not only work top down, we also have to work bottom up. We should address the needs of the segments that are really being affected as well by the aftermath of so many of the natural disasters that happen. The farmers, the fishermen, they really know what kind of information we should be looking for, whether it's from information we get from sensory sources on Earth or from space, and how can we leverage on that. Now, during COP28, all of these platforms, a lot of conversations have sparked, declarations, agreements, and so on. Now, bringing the partnerships and making sure that this continuum just keep gaining momentum, and we work together toward achieving the objectives, whether it's those declarations at COP28 or prior COP28, and we continue working with COP29, COP30, and beyond that.
Yeah, thank you.
Well said.
Yeah, so you've highlighted. You're starting to highlight all these other areas that maybe people aren't so familiar with space and climate, things like deforestation, but also oceans. Talk a lot about sensors, and of course, as you get the importance of ground truth and sensors on the Earth, and many places, of course, on the Earth don't have connectivity to report that data, and that connectivity is going to come or starting to come from space, from constellations, from Starlink and Amazon's Project Kuiper and OneWeb and others as well. So that's another, if people don't appreciate, that's where all that data in many parts of the world is going to come from, that connectivity from assets in space as well. So I just want to spend a few minutes talking about some of these other areas that people might not realize that come to mind in space. You mentioned fisheries, right? People might not really think about that. There's even some interesting discussions about space applications and understanding the effects of climate change on land use and interactions with people with animals, which is important for environmental assessments and pandemic prevention in the
Yes.
future. So I just sort of opened up. Maybe Artie, you talked about this a little bit. Do you want to talk more about some of the interesting things that people are doing that might not might not directly connect space and some of these things?
So if we think about the information that we need to get from areas of the world that we don't really have direct access to on Earth, like the ocean life, life underwater, and the monitoring that we need to do on these levels. One of the things that we have to, for example, the monitoring of the color of the ocean. Monitoring the color of the ocean across the world, and how does that affect life underwater, and how does it affect the reserve that we have across the world. Now, the chlorophyll, for example, is one of the elements that we need to also monitor through satellite imaging, and that affects the food sources underwater and affects directly the reserve that we have, that will affect then the economic, the market, that affects the fishermen, and how does that affect the food chain, how does it affect the food security around the world. Another thing that we need as well to be mindful of is monitoring the water resources. The whole world is being affected by water scarcity. And how can we monitor the water resources across the world, and monitor how does that affect as well the ecological system, the biodiversity around the world, and where can we get information from? We should acknowledge that every nation, every country, every player, whether on an individual level, on a government level, or corporate level, has something to contribute to. If they don't have the ability to invest in space technologies, they will be able to contribute with something else. So that's what we should acknowledge. Everyone has something to contribute, and everyone has something to bring to the table, and that collaboration is going to really push forward the solutions that we're trying to bring together to addressing the climate crisis worldwide.
If I can just give a slightly different approach to this same notion of everybody has something to contribute, I would say everybody has a role to play. Your session is more about the climate goals, but it's also about human activity that impacts the climate, the environment, and biodiversity and sustainability overall. I wanted to, give the example of illegal, unregulated fishing. In Peru, the Peruvian government put a law in place that mandated every shipping vessel that entered Peruvian waters to be equipped with satellite equipment to report its catches. But more importantly, they made sure that they were using high-resolution satellite imagery to look at those ships and know exactly when they were coming into those waters. The combination of the equipment, the law, and the imagery that they were using enabled them to reduce the number of illegal fishing vessels from 300 to 40 in 1 year. That's great. However, what happens now? Those vessels go to other areas, other countries, where there aren't such laws in place. So everybody needs to pull in the same direction so that we eliminate these kind of problems and that we really make a difference at scale.
So we need to both cooperate, but also have, again, data that helps with both transparency and accountability.
I would just say to that point, I think we're at an amazing moment. We're actually at a couple of amazing moments in the story of these capabilities. So one of them is, we've now created and are creating the next generation of continuous, comprehensive, all of planet, that is the whole Earth, observational systems, and they are comprehensive enough, I think, in such a way that we are seeing an age of radical transparency being born in front of our eyes. The satellites, I'll use planets as an example, but this is certainly not going to be unique to us in the future. historically, these instruments were so expensive and so difficult to access that you might be able to see a snapshot in one place at a given time. And that's sort of tailor-made for people to move to the next province over and start overfishing in the next part of the seas. But if you're monitoring the whole planet every day, there's no place to hide. We see this, we do a lot of work on illegal and unregulated fishing, and we watch these fleets enter waters with their AIS transponders operating, and then they turn them off. And they come in and they overfish, and then they go back out to international waters, and they go back and forth and do this. Well, the thing that's really interesting is we can just literally rewind the tape because we're capturing every day and we keep it forever. So we can watch the boats in reverse go all the way back to their port of origin, like winding the tape back. And that has caused, with some governments that we work with, profound, like very significant levels of arrests and, interdiction efforts that were impossible before because we were able to prove something that happened months ago when no one thought to look for it. So I think that's happening in climate. I think it's going to happen in biodiversity. It's going to happen in all of these areas.
So, I'm going to give you the smallest entity here, the last word here. We're running out of time, and so go ahead. What you want to give your final thoughts, and then we'll wrap it up.
Yeah, thank you, Lloyd. As I was listening to Artie, Her Excellency, and Andrew, on all the different ways we can use the satellite data, and obviously illegal fishing was a very key part. I think probably the most important next step as a collective community, as a space community, is to now think about how do we break silos. A lot of space companies operate in their own silos. They're maritime security expert, and therefore they only focus on maritime security. But a lot of the intelligence that we need, because we need to move now from data to intelligence, because the person on the ground, the farmer, the fisherman, the islander, doesn't really care where the data comes from. They just need to know what they need to do. And so that is the last mile that we need to work towards. How do we get the intelligence? And in order to get the intelligence, we need to think about data fusion. We need to think about how does illegal fisheries have a direct relation to coral health, because ghost nets drift away and get tangled in either the reefs or the megafauna. And so that is really where we see the biggest value is that the space sector can bring, but also how the governments around the world can think about where should funding go, where should efforts go, is really in trying to combine all of these different sources, enrich the context, and then really get those pieces of intelligence that can help the communities like ours.
So hopefully we've tried to break a few of those silos down today. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, that concludes our forum this morning. And on behalf of the Atlantic Council and the World Government Summit, I want to thank the panelists for participating and everyone who joined us to listen here and online, and enjoy the rest of the summit.
Thank you, Lloyd.